I think that's right. I mean, there's so much going on. I mean, again, like the piece is mostly an assessment, like trying to be a clear-eyed and fair assessment of his role in, in the course of the pandemic, which is not blindered either by like the liberal infatuation or the conservative demonization, right? And one of the big problems that I do point to briefly in the piece is that like once a figure is demonized by the right, the left meaning Democratic liberals, the resistance, they become more and more infatuated with them, and that makes the right demonize them more. And so there's basically this like recursive loop with certain figures where it doesn't really matter what they do. It's all spectacle. Like Mueller was the same way. Like Mueller never really gave any indication. He was completely silent. He never gave any indication that he wanted to like stick it to Trump, really. Yeah. And this guy is like, I mean, fucking, oversaw the FBI during the height of like anti-Muslim paranoia after 9/11. He's not a liberal hero, but they attached this whole kind of fantasy to him. And then because they did that, the right, without any new information, new evidence, he was silent, started to see him as an enemy of Trump. And the same thing happened with Fauci. There was just this kind of, I call it in the piece like the Trump era two-step, where the right demonizes somebody, so the left becomes infatuated with them, and it just is this reinforcing loop. As far as his culpability, I think it's right that the best argument and the only one that's made usually to defend Fauci, like let's just like looking at the facts, like the pandemic response was a fucking disaster. He is understood to be the public facing federal government official who is most associated with the medical, scientific, and public health response to the disaster. It was a disaster. More than 400,000 people are dead. Like in a sane democratic culture, we would say this bureaucrat fucked up, and we would want his head on a stick. I mean, that's not like, regardless of whether it would be right, in a normal functioning democracy, that would be what you would expect. The argument against it is that it's all Trump's fault. Trump fucked it all up. Fauci was doing the best that he could. He does have this commendable record of, especially he's lauded for his behavior ultimately during the AIDS years, though he was criticized initially by ACT UP activists and people like that. He ultimately befriended people like Larry Kramer and Peter Staley.
Very harshly criticized at first.
Oh yeah, I mean, right. They Larry Kramer famously wrote a open letter. I think it was published in the what was it? It was probably the Village Voice or something like that, where he called him a murderer. He said, I called you an idiot, and now I'm calling you a murderer. But ultimately, because Fauci made these decisions where he brought the activists into the room and they had these conversations about how basically making the drug trials open to more people who are suffering from the virus. He had this good reputation coming into this crisis and understood to be this kind of champion of science and blah, blah, blah. Nonetheless, the argument is that Fauci tried his best, and in every way in which the response went poorly, it was Trump's fault. The argument that I make in the piece is basically like, if Fauci's only blameless if he was completely powerless to stop the administration from pursuing its disastrous and obviously stupid plans. But if he was powerless, if he couldn't have affected the outcomes, then he should have resigned. Then he should have communicated bluntly to the public, this is the truth, this is what's really happening here, and it's a complete disaster, and I can't stop it. Yeah,
I mean, it is a weird thing, because once you start to think about the standard things that are said on Fauci's behalf, so like one of them is that he's awesome because he's like a bold truth teller. He'll just say, he'll say whatever's true without shrinking from it. And another one is, well,
yeah, I see where you're going with this.
He didn't say a bunch of things that were true, but that's okay.
But that's good. Yeah,
that's good. that's justifiable because that helped him preserve his influence, and he would have been driven out of the tree. He couldn't have continued to work behind the scenes if he hadn't. Or in the mask case, that it's good because it was like a noble lie to preserve the supply of masks for for medical professionals. And similarly, right, there's this there's this weird tension between he's good because he could. It's good that he wasn't a bold truth teller because he could preserve his influence, behind the scenes, and so he could do more good that way. But also, you can't blame him for anything because what could he do? It's not like Trump would listen.
Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, I do think that most of the defenses of him are internally contradictory. You can't simultaneously say that it was vital for him to be in the room because he was a voice of truth and facts in an administration that didn't care about those things, and say that when we criticize him for example, with the mask thing, like lying about their efficacy in order to protect some other interest of the public health response, then that's okay. Or even worse, I mean, he declined to really vociferously contradict Trump, and he acknowledges that he did in order to stay in the room. But if his role in the room is to be the voice of truth and reason, who's never afraid to tell the truth, then it's undermining, it's self-undermining all of the arguments. I mean, in the Times, like a couple of weeks ago, after Biden took office, or maybe right before Biden took office, but once it was clear Trump had lost, he said, I felt that if I stepped down, that would leave a void. Someone's got to not be afraid to speak the truth, speak out the truth. And this was the argument people were making on his behalf. But if he was there to speak the truth, and the argument for the moments in which he didn't speak the truth is that he needed to be there anyway. Right. Your listeners are smart enough to understand how this is just kind of an endless loop of contradictory arguments.
This has been a free public preview of a patron exclusive episode of Give Them an Argument. To get the rest of this episode and every other patron exclusive episode, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis.